I was born with something people in my village called the gift of the spirit eye. Ever since I was a child, I could see things other people couldn't. Some nights, I would wake up and find a woman with long black hair standing silently at the foot of my bed. Other times, while walking alone through the rice fields, I would hear someone whisper my name from the old cemetery nearby. But whenever I turned around, no one was there. My grandfather once told me, in our bloodline, some are born able to see both the living and the dead. Then he looked me straight in the eyes and said, and trust me, that's not always a blessing. Years later, when I returned to our ancestral home, a crumbling wooden mansion over 100 years old in the Mekong Delta, I finally understood what he meant. Because buried beneath that house was a secret soaked in blood. And this is the story of how it all began. More than a century ago, this entire region belonged to one woman, Madame Hai So. She was one of the wealthiest landowners in southern Vietnam, owning hundreds of acres of rice fields, dozens of servants, and enough power to make entire families disappear. But people didn't fear her because of her money. They feared her because of her cruelty. Madame Hai So had 2 daughters. The eldest, Bic, was breathtakingly beautiful, soft-spoken, and kind-hearted. The younger daughter, Lean, was clever, quiet, and far more obedient. Inside that mansion, servants were treated worse than animals. A broken bowl could mean a beating. A careless word could cost someone their livelihood. And whenever villagers saw Madame Hai So coming down the road, they lowered their heads and stepped aside. People often whispered, "That house may be rich, but it's cursed." Bic fell in love with Huang, a poor farmhand who worked in her family's rice fields. He was tall, hard-working, honest, the kind of man who loved with his whole soul. They met in secret beside a narrow canal behind the mansion, beneath an old flowering apricot tree. For almost a year, their love remained hidden. Until one day, her mother found out. The screams that echoed through the house that afternoon were heard across the village. "You are the daughter of a noble family! How dare you shame me with a filthy peasant!" Madame Hai So slapped Bic so hard her lips split open. Huang was dragged into the courtyard, tied to a wooden post and beaten until he lost consciousness. But what drove Madame Hai So truly insane was the fact that Bic was already 3 months pregnant. Bic was locked inside a dark room. The doors were chained shut. No one was allowed to speak to her. Every day, Madame Hai So personally brought her herbal medicine. She told her it was to strengthen the baby. But after only a few days, Bic began bleeding. Her stomach twisted in unbearable pain. She cried and screamed through the night. But somehow, the baby survived. And then, suddenly, Madame Hai So changed. She became gentle, soft-spoken. She stroked Bic's hair and whispered, "Keep the baby. I've accepted it." Bic believed her. She had no idea. Huang had already been dead for 3 days. His body had been hacked into pieces and dumped into the canal behind the house. The night Bic went into labor, a violent storm swept across the village. Thunder shook the roof. Lightning split the sky. Then finally, a baby's cry filled the room. For one brief moment, life existed. Then, suddenly, silence. When Bit woke up, her arms were empty. She looked down at her body. and her baby was gone. She screamed, "Where's my son?" Madame Haisot stood quietly in the shadows, her face cold as stone. Then she spoke words that shattered Bic's soul forever. "He's in the jar." Behind the house stood a large clay jar. Inside, her newborn baby was still alive. Madame Haisot had placed him there herself. Then, with her own hands, she poured lime powder over his tiny body. Again and again, until his cries grew weaker and weaker, until there was nothing left. That night, everyone in the mansion heard a baby crying in the backyard, but no one dared step outside. After losing both the man she loved and her child, Bic lost her mind. Every day she sat beside that clay jar, singing lullabies to no one. 3 months later, she died of typhoid fever. But after her funeral, the house was never quiet again. At midnight, servants heard footsteps walking across the roof. A woman sobbing beneath the apricot tree. A child laughing inside Bic's empty bedroom. Then one night, Madame Haisot let out a scream so horrifying that the entire household woke up. When they rushed into her room, they found her curled on the floor, clutching her stomach. Her finger pointed toward the ceiling, her voice shaking. "She's back. She wants her baby." The family summoned Master Mai-Hien Thon, the most feared spiritual healer in the region. The moment he stepped through the front gate, his face turned pale. He closed his eyes and whispered, "There are 3 restless spirits in this house. A woman, a man whose body was torn apart, and a child who was never allowed to live." Then he turned to Madame Haisot and said, "Your sins are too heavy. They never left." He placed red talismans across the wooden beams of the house, and for a while, everything became quiet. But it was only a false peace. Years later, I returned to that house as the last living descendant of the family. On my first night there, I woke up because I felt someone standing beside my bed. When I opened my eyes, I saw a thin man covered in mud and blood. His teeth were sharp, almost like fangs. He stared at me and smiled. Then he whispered, "You're the last one." And the child has grown. A year later, my relatives decided to tear down the old mansion. The moment the workers began digging, 3 men collapsed at the same time, foaming at the mouth. Their eyes rolled back. One of them kept screaming, "Give the land back. This ground belongs to us." When they dug deeper, they found it. An old clay jar buried beneath the soil. Inside were the tiny white bones of an infant. And beside them, a rotting red talisman. At that exact moment, from beneath the old apricot tree, a child's laughter echoed across the yard. Clear, sharp, and impossible to explain, even in broad daylight. And that was when I realized some spirits never forgive.